He worked on a construction site, barely making ends meet. Every day he picked up his daughter from school and shared a modest dinner with her. But one day, the girl shared a piece of bread with a strange boy at the bakery, not knowing that he was the son of a billionaire. This simple gesture changed her father's fate forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The city had a way of waking slowly, as if the early haze of dawn needed time to loosen its grip before people could move freely through its streets. For Elliot Mason, however, there was no delay, no luxury of stretching beneath the covers or lingering over the faint warmth of morning light. He had long ago trained his body to obey the call of work, and even before the sun had broken across the skyline, he was already walking toward the gates of the construction site where he earned his living. His boots, worn from years of labor, pressed into the dust of the ground with a steady rhythm. The smell of damp concrete and iron dust hung thick in the air. All around him machines hummed and clattered, steel beams clanged against one another, and voices barked across the half-formed skeletons of buildings. For most of the men there, it was nothing more than a job, but for Elliot, it was both lifeline and prison. He had once walked different halls, cleaner, brighter, filled with chalkboards and diagrams instead of dirt and scaffolding. As a young man, he had entered a prestigious university, carrying with him the restless brilliance of a mind fascinated by design and engineering. While others struggled with complex equations, he absorbed them with the ease of someone born to see the inner mechanics of the world. His professors had spoken of him with promise, hinting at a future where his inventions might alter industries. Yet promises can collapse under the weight of reality, and for Elliot, reality had come in the form of a daughter. Her name was Lily, and she had entered the world with the quiet cry of new life, just as Elliot's carefully drawn plans for the future were being written. Her mother, once the soft voice that shared his dreams of success, decided that burden was too heavy. She disappeared, leaving Elliot to hold the tiny body of their child alone, uncertain of how to balance a lecture hall's equations with the hunger and needs of an infant. The university soon became impossible. He left, not in disgrace, but in sacrifice. The scholarship he had earned, the career that had been promised, they all dissolved beneath the pressing urgency of keeping his daughter alive. The years that followed carved themselves into his body like etchings into stone. His shoulders bore the weight of lumber, his hands hardened into tools of their own, and his skin learned the language of sun and dust. The construction site became his second home. Day after day, he bent his back under heavy loads, sometimes pausing only long enough to stretch aching muscles before lifting again. Though sweat darkened his clothes and calluses split across his palms, there remained in him a spark of what he had once been. In the quiet moments, when the shouting of foremen died down and the machines idled, he would sketch crude diagrams on scraps of paper, improvements to pulleys, safer ways to scaffold, small reminders to himself that he was not only a laborer, but still, in essence, an engineer. What tethered him most securely to the grueling rhythm was Lily. As she grew from infant to child, his life became measured by her laughter, her drawings taped to their small apartment's wall, her endless questions about why the sky changed colors or how bridges stood without falling. Every afternoon, no matter how long his shift had stretched, Elliot made certain he was there to collect her from school. He would wipe his hands on a rag, brush the dust from his hair, and make his way to the schoolyard gates, boots heavy yet determined. When she spotted him, her eyes lit in a way that washed away the exhaustion of the day. Their ritual after school was sacred. Sometimes they walked the cracked sidewalks to a small bakery near the bus stop, where the smell of fresh bread seemed to soften the city's harshness. Other times they sat on blocks of concrete piled behind the construction site, sharing a thermos of tea and cheap rolls bought from a street vendor. Lily always talked more than she ate, describing her lessons, her classmates, the shapes she had seen in the clouds. Elliot listened, answering her curiosity with patience, offering explanations both simple and clever, though his voice often carried the fatigue of labor. Yet for Lily, he was more than tired hands and dusty clothes. He was her hero, a man who could build anything and fix everything, even if the world refused to see it. Still, there lingered within him the shadow of what might have been. He remembered the laboratories, the textbooks he could no longer afford, the way his professors had once leaned forward in genuine admiration of his ideas. At night, after Lily had drifted to sleep in their modest home, Elliot often sat in the dim glow of a lamp, leafing through borrowed engineering manuals, sketching lines and figures that only he seemed to understand. But each time he closed the books, he was reminded that tomorrow would demand not theories, but labor. The tension between his untapped potential and his present reality gnawed at him, a constant reminder that dreams could wither when forced to bend to necessity. Lily, however, never allowed his spirit to collapse entirely. Her innocence shielded him from despair. She looked at him not with pity, but with unwavering admiration. In her eyes, he was already the engineer he once longed to be. She asked him to explain the workings of elevators, the secret strength of bridges, the reason cranes could lift such enormous loads. When he explained, sometimes drawing quick sketches on napkins or on the back of her homework, she listened with rapt attention. It was in those moments that Elliot glimpsed himself anew, not as a failed student or broken dreamer, but as a teacher, a father, and a man whose knowledge still had worth. The contrast between them deepened the poignancy of their bond. Lily, full of laughter and curiosity, was untouched by the bitterness of lost opportunities. Elliot carried that bitterness quietly, never speaking of what he had surrendered, yet it lingered in the way his shoulders slumped at the end of the day. Their conversations, their shared meals of simple bread and tea, were bridges across the chasm of his regret. Each smile from her, each time she grabbed his hand as they walked home, reminded him that sacrifice had its rewards, even if those rewards were intangible. On the construction site, some of the men teased him for bringing his daughter by in the afternoons, for sitting with her on piles of stone, instead of sharing drinks after a shift. But Elliot paid them no mind. Those moments with Lily were the true payment for his labor. He had given up the pursuit of his career, yet in exchange, he received the warmth of her trust and the spark of her belief. It was a bargain he could live with, though a part of him always whispered that he could have been more. The city's skyline changed slowly as new towers rose, their steel ribs reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. Elliot built them piece by piece, his sweat hidden in the mortar, his strength buried in their walls. No one would ever know the name of the man who had tightened the bolts, lifted the beams, or guided the scaffolds into place. Yet each evening, as he walked Lily home past the shining glass of buildings he had helped raise, he carried a quiet pride. Even if the world did not know him, she did. And for now, that was enough. As autumn settled across the city, the rhythm of their lives continued in its steady cycle. Work, school, bakery, home. Lily thrived under his care, and Elliot endured for her sake. But beneath the routine, fate was moving, shaping moments that would soon alter the course of their lives. A chance encounter was waiting just around the corner, one that neither of them could foresee, but which would forever entwine their modest world with another, far grander one. For now, though, they sat together on their familiar concrete perch, sharing the last of their bread as the sun dipped below the horizon, a father and daughter, bound not by wealth or privilege, but by sacrifice, resilience, and love. The days drifted into a rhythm that Elliot and Lily knew by heart, yet within that rhythm, there was always a quiet sense that something unexpected might wait just beyond the bend of routine. Autumn was maturing into its full shape, the air sharper and tinged with the faint smell of wood smoke that lingered between the tall buildings. The city carried its usual weight, the press of commuters, the endless roar of machinery, the clatter of footsteps that rose and fell like an unbroken tide. For Elliot, those days began with dust and noise on the construction site, and ended with the warmth of Lily's chatter over bread and tea. He had settled into the idea that life, though difficult, had reached a kind of balance. Yet balance is fragile, and it takes only one small moment to shift everything. On a Thursday afternoon, the kind that seemed pulled from the fabric of countless others, Elliot left the site with aching muscles and tired eyes, though his pace quickened as he neared the school. Lily was waiting at the gates, her backpack slightly unzipped, papers jutting out, her hair messy from recess, but her face alight with joy when she saw him. That joy always undid the knots in his chest. Together they walked, as they often did, toward the small bakery at the corner where the scent of warm bread spilled into the street. The bakery was modest, with fogged glass windows and shelves that leaned slightly from years of use. But for them, it was a place of comfort, a tiny sanctuary carved out of the city's hardness. Inside, the air was filled with the golden smell of sugar and yeast. The baker, a stout woman who knew them by sight, offered a nod as Elliot paid for 2 simple rolls, the kind he could afford. Lily skipped at his side, clutching her prize as though it were treasure. They stepped back onto the street, the noise of cars and distant shouts swirling around them, and chose their usual spot on a bench not far from the bakery window. Elliot sat heavily, pulling the thermos of tea from his bag, while Lily tore off a small piece of her roll, speaking animatedly about a story her teacher had read aloud. He listened, tired but content, grateful for the way her presence colored the gray edges of his life. It was then that Lily noticed him, a boy sitting just a little distance away on the low stone ledge beneath the bakery window. At first, Elliot had not paid him much mind. The city was full of children, some waiting for parents, some loitering in groups. But this boy was different. He sat alone, shoulders rounded, gaze fixed not on the street, but somewhere inward, as if he were trying to disappear from the world that moved busily around him. His clothes were fine, far finer than anything Lily had ever worn. A crisp shirt under a sweater, shoes that gleamed faintly even in the dull light. Yet despite the neatness, there was something hollow in the way he held himself. His hands rested limply on his knees, and his eyes had the distant look of someone who had lost something no one else could see. Lily's chatter faltered as she watched him. There was a pull in her, the natural instinct of a child whose heart had not yet learned the barriers of class or circumstance. She clutched her roll, then hopped down from the bench and walked toward the boy. Elliot, half rising, thought to stop her, but something in the openness of her movement held him still. He watched as she approached, small but confident, and stood before the boy. Without hesitation, she extended her hand, holding out the roll she had barely touched. The boy looked at her, then back again, as though he did not know what to do. For a long moment nothing happened. The world reduced to the space between them. Then, slowly, he reached out and accepted the piece of bread. His lips trembled into something faintly resembling a smile, awkward, but genuine, the first sign of warmth breaking through the mask of detachment. Elliot felt something stir in his chest as he watched them. There was pride, yes, but also a kind of wonder, Lily had not thought of the cost of her gesture, of the difference between their lives, of the unspoken rules that kept people apart. She had only seen someone who looked sad and acted. In that small act of kindness, she revealed the truth that he had always known, but sometimes forgotten. She carried in her the ability to heal wounds that no medicine could touch. He watched as the boy's eyes lit, just slightly, and how Lily sat down beside him, beginning to talk with the same energy she had always reserved for him. Though Elliot could not hear every word, he could see by the tilt of her head and the way the boy's posture shifted that something invisible was happening. A quiet restoration, a bridge being built. He leaned back on the bench, his gaze shifting for a moment to the street. That was when he noticed the car. It was parked just beyond the bakery, sleek and black, polished until it reflected the passers-by like a mirror. A driver sat in the front, hands resting neatly on the wheel, eyes sharp as they flicked toward the boy and back again. This was no ordinary vehicle, and no ordinary family it served. Elliot understood, without needing to ask, that the boy came from wealth, from a world carved of influence and privilege. And yet here he was, sitting alone on a cold stone ledge, grateful for a scrap of bread offered by a construction worker's daughter. The contrast pressed heavily against Elliot's heart. He wondered what story lay behind that boy's eyes, what kind of absence had carved such emptiness into a child so young. His own daughter had filled his life with light despite hardship, but this boy seemed adrift in shadow despite every material comfort. It struck him then, with a force he had not expected, that loneliness obeyed no boundaries. Money could not shield against it, nor status, nor power. It was the simplest things: companionship, kindness, a moment of being seen that restored a soul. The afternoon waned as Lily returned to his side, her cheeks flushed from excitement, the boy watching her leave with a gaze softer than before. Elliot placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and together they began their walk home. Behind them, the car door opened quietly, and the boy slipped inside, vanishing into the silent world of tinted windows and leather seats. Elliot said nothing to Lily about what he had seen. Instead, he listened as she spoke of her new friend, her voice alight with pride that she had made someone smile. He kept his thoughts to himself, though inside, something had shifted. He could not name it, not yet. But he sensed that this small encounter was the first tremor of a greater change. As the evening deepened, they returned to their modest apartment, the sound of distant sirens echoing through the streets. Lily fell asleep quickly, her innocence unburdened by the complexities of the day. Elliot, however, lay awake longer, staring at the cracked ceiling above him. He thought of the boy, of the car, of the way Lily had bridged two worlds without hesitation. He thought, too, of how different his own life might have been had someone extended such a gesture to him at the right moment. The city outside whispered its ceaseless lullaby, but Elliot remained awake, restless, carrying the sense that his life, once predictable in its struggles, was beginning to tilt toward something he could not yet see. The following days returned to their usual rhythm, but beneath the surface, the memory of that encounter lingered. Lily spoke of the boy often, wondering aloud if he would be there again, if he had liked the role, if he would want to play another time. Elliot listened, nodding, though he wondered if the boy's world would ever allow such simplicity. Yet as he watched his daughter's excitement, he realized that her kindness had left an imprint, not only on the boy, but on him as well. For the first time in years, Elliot felt that life might be preparing to open a door, one that had been locked for too long. And though he did not yet know what lay beyond, he felt a faint stirring of anticipation that rivaled even the exhaustion of his long days. The chance encounter at the bakery was small in appearance, almost invisible in the noise of the city. but it was the kind of moment that quietly rearranges the course of lives. In time, Elliot would look back and understand that it was here, on that cool afternoon with bread shared between strangers, that the threads of destiny began to weave something greater. For now, though, it remained simply a kindness, a brief meeting between two children from different worlds, one that would grow into a story far larger than either of them could yet imagine. The memory of that afternoon at the bakery did not fade quickly. For Elliot, it remained in his mind, like a faint echo that returned at odd moments, when he carried heavy loads across the scaffolding, when he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, when he sat across from Lily at their modest kitchen table. He would see again her small hand offering bread, the boy's uncertain gaze softening into the trace of a smile, and he would feel a quiet tremor of something larger moving around them. For Lily, the encounter became a bright thread she tugged at constantly, speaking of the boy with casual wonder, her voice filled with certainty that he would one day be her friend. Elliot did not share her certainty, but he did not take it from her either. Instead, he let her hope, because in her hope was something pure and undeniable, the kind of belief that adults too often lose. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, within a home that stood like a fortress of glass and steel, Graham Clark listened to his son tell a story. It was a rare event. Since the death of his wife, Oliver had spoken little, his words emerging slowly, if at all, as though each syllable weighed too much for him to bear. But now, at dinner, the boy's eyes lifted, and he spoke of a girl he had met, a girl who had given him bread and sat beside him without asking for anything in return. Graham froze, knife and fork poised above his plate, and looked at his son with astonishment. There was a light in Oliver's eyes that he had not seen in years, a faint glow that had been absent since grief had settled into his small frame. Graham listened as Oliver recounted the simple scene, his voice hesitant but steady. It was not the story itself that stunned him. It was the change it revealed. Something had pierced through the fog of silence and sadness, and that something was a girl he had never met. In the days that followed, Graham found himself restless. He was a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, to making decisions that shaped fortunes. Yet here was a change in his son he had not orchestrated. It unnerved him and moved him in equal measure. He instructed his driver to return to the bakery, to watch quietly, to discover who the girl and her father were. What returned to him was a portrait so unexpected it unsettled him further. A laborer in dusty clothes, a man with the marks of hard work etched into his hands and shoulders, and a daughter with bright eyes who spoke without fear. The driver described how the man waited patiently as the girl shared her bread, how he stood protectively nearby but did not interfere, and how together they walked home, their figures modest against the city's noise. Graham could not shake the image. He decided he needed to meet them himself. The meeting came by design, though to Elliot it felt like chance. One evening, after his shift, he collected Lily, and together they once again passed the bakery. The light was dimming, shadows lengthening across the street, when a tall figure in a tailored coat stepped from the doorway of a nearby building. Graham Clark carried himself with the ease of wealth, his shoes shining even against the grit of the pavement, his posture unbent by labor. Yet his face bore lines of strain, the kind that money does not erase. He approached slowly, his gaze directed first at Lily, then at Elliot. There was curiosity in his expression, but also something gentler, a searching look that unsettled Elliot's guarded heart. They exchanged introductions, their words polite, though Elliot felt the weight of difference pressing between them. He was acutely aware of the dust on his jacket, the roughness of his palms, the exhaustion in his voice. Graham, by contrast, seemed carved from another world entirely, one of boardrooms and decisions made with pen strokes instead of sweat. Yet as they spoke, a shift occurred. Graham asked about Elliot's work, and though Elliot began cautiously, reluctant to expose himself to pity or condescension, the conversation soon turned to matters of mechanics and construction. Without realizing it, Elliot's eyes brightened, and his hands began to sketch shapes in the air, describing better ways to anchor scaffolding, safer methods of lifting steel beams, the flaws he saw daily that could be solved with careful design. Graham listened, and to his own surprise, he was captivated. This man, hidden behind a laborer's exterior, spoke with the precision and imagination of an engineer, a mind unbroken by years of toil. It was in that moment that Graham recognized something rare. He saw not only the man before him, but the potential that still lived within him, dormant but alive. He thought of his company, of the endless meetings with men who lacked vision, who only repeated formulas without innovation. In Elliot, he glimpsed the spark he had been searching for, though he had not known he was searching. More than that, he saw the connection between Elliot's daughter and his own son, how one small act of kindness had accomplished what he, with all his resources, had failed to do. He considered the possibility that this was not chance at all, but the beginning of something larger. When Graham spoke of opportunity, offering Elliot the chance to step into his company, the words landed like a blow. Elliot stood silent, his thoughts tangled. The idea was absurd. He was a man who had abandoned his studies, who had labored on construction sites for nearly a decade, who barely managed to keep the lights on at home. To stand in the polished halls of Clark Industries seemed a dream so distant it was almost cruel to mention. He shook his head, muttered that he was not qualified, that his life had taken him too far from such things. Yet Graham pressed gently, his voice calm but insistent, telling him that talent mattered more than degrees, that some men only needed a chance. Elliot returned home that night, torn between disbelief and fear. He looked at his daughter, already asleep, her hair spread across the pillow, her small hand clutching the corner of her blanket. She was the reason he had sacrificed everything, and now she was the reason opportunity had found him again. It was through her kindness, her unthinking generosity, that doors were opening. But doors could close as swiftly as they opened, and he was terrified of failing. Memories of abandoned classrooms, of professors' disappointed faces, of the moment he walked away with no plan but survival. All of it pressed against him. He feared stepping into a world that would expose him as inadequate. The days that followed were restless ones. At work, his thoughts wandered, his concentration slipping as he considered what such a leap would mean. His co-workers noticed his distraction, some mocking, others ignoring. But Elliot paid them little mind. His greatest conflict played out within. He wanted to believe he was capable of more, yet doubt clung to him like a second skin. At night, he sat at the small table with paper spread before him, scribbling sketches of machines, calculations spilling into margins. The old thrill of creation stirred, but alongside it came the heavy hand of caution. He asked himself if he had the right to hope again. It was Lily who anchored him. Though she knew little of the details, she sensed the turmoil in him. She watched him quietly, her eyes full of trust, and when he looked back at her, he saw no judgment, only belief. That belief, unspoken but steady, became the fuel he had lacked. She thought him capable of anything, and in her innocence, she might have been closer to truth than he dared admit. He realized slowly that he could not continue to deny her vision of him. To do so would mean teaching her to abandon her own dreams one day. And so, with trembling resolve, He began to lean toward the possibility that Graham Clark's offer was not a cruel illusion, but an open hand. The intertwining of their lives had begun with bread shared on a street corner, but now it deepened into something more substantial. Graham, a man of wealth yet emotionally impoverished, found in Elliot not just a potential employee, but a reminder of integrity and resilience. Elliot, a man worn by labor, yet rich in quiet brilliance, found in Graham the possibility of reclaiming a path he thought forever lost. Between them, their children had already forged the first bond, proof that even across the widest divides, connection was possible. And though uncertainty clouded the path ahead, both men sensed that the meeting had marked a turning point. Their fates, once moving in parallel but separate lines, had begun to converge, pulling them toward a future that none of them could yet fully imagine. The offer hung in Elliot's mind like a heavy weight he carried from one day into the next. It followed him onto the scaffolding, where he tightened bolts and lifted beams, and it sat beside him at the table, where Lily's laughter filled their modest kitchen. Graham Clark's words echoed, not loud but insistent, asking him to believe in something he had long ago locked away. For years he had defined himself only as a worker, a father, a man who had traded promise for responsibility. To imagine himself stepping into an office of glass and steel where decisions shaped skylines seemed like inviting disappointment to crush him. Yet doubt and hope wrestled inside him with equal force, and slowly, hope began to win. The first days at Clark Industries were overwhelming. Elliot had been accustomed to grit and dust, to the clang of hammers and the roar of machinery. But here, the air was hushed, conditioned, filled with the faint hum of computers and the low murmur of voices that carried authority. He entered wearing the only jacket he owned that was not frayed at the cuffs, his boots polished as best he could manage, yet he still felt the eyes of men and women who judged by appearance. He knew what they saw, a laborer masquerading in borrowed skin. He felt their skepticism in the silence that followed introductions, in the raised brows, in the faint smiles of disbelief. Yet beneath the weight of their doubt, he remembered Lily's eyes watching him from their kitchen table, eyes filled with faith that did not waver. He clung to that faith like a rope. At first he kept quiet. He observed, listening to the way engineers discussed blueprints and materials, noting the numbers that flashed across screens, the strategies debated in brisk voices. They spoke in jargon he had once known intimately, but which felt rusty now, like a muscle long unused. He stayed late into the evening, poring over documents others had left behind, tracing lines on blueprints, reawakening the part of his mind that had been buried under years of labor. Slowly, confidence returned, cautious but insistent. He began to see flaws in designs, inefficiencies in methods, risks hidden in the details. And though his voice trembled at first, he started to share his thoughts. His ideas were met with polite nods, then dismissals, then quiet reconsideration when results proved him right. He proposed a modification to a scaffold system that reduced both cost and danger, and when implemented, the improvement was undeniable. He suggested a new sequence for lifting steel sections that saved hours of labor, and the efficiency was measurable. The same men and women who had once looked at him with skepticism now leaned forward when he spoke, their pens moving to capture his words. Elliot found himself not merely surviving in this world, but shaping it, his old brilliance emerging like a flame that had been shielded but not extinguished. Meanwhile, Lily and Oliver grew closer. The bakery remained their place of meeting, but soon their friendship extended beyond. Oliver, once silent and withdrawn, found joy in Lily's laughter, in the games she invented, in the simple companionship she offered without judgment. He taught her words from his books, and she taught him to find shapes in clouds, to laugh at silly stories, to believe again in small wonders. Together they bridged the divide between their worlds. For Graham, watching his son come alive again was both a gift and a wound, for it reminded him of the years when grief had stolen Oliver's childhood. He understood, though, that it was Lily's kindness, and through her, Elliot's presence, that had restored what wealth could not. As months passed, Elliot's place in the company solidified. He no longer felt like an intruder walking borrowed corridors. Instead, he felt like a man finally standing where he belonged. The moment of true recognition came when Graham asked him to lead the presentation of a new project before the company's board and partners. Elliot resisted at first, unwilling to place himself at the center, but Graham insisted, reminding him that the ideas were his, and only he could convey them fully. Elliot spent nights preparing, sketching diagrams by hand before transferring them to slides, practicing words that felt foreign in his mouth, yet truer with each attempt. Lily, perched on their worn sofa, watched him rehearse, sometimes offering small corrections, sometimes simply smiling, which gave him courage more than any practice could. The day of the presentation arrived, and Elliot entered the grand hall, where polished tables gleamed under bright lights, where men in suits and women in tailored dresses filled the air with the quiet rustle of authority. He stood at the front, his heart pounding like a hammer in his chest, his hands trembling until he pressed them against the lectern. Then he began to speak. At first his voice faltered, but as he described the problem and then the solution, his words steadied. He spoke not only as an engineer, but as a man who had lived the work, who had carried steel on his back and felt the danger of weak designs in his bones. He spoke with clarity, with conviction, with the raw honesty of someone who understood both the theory and the labor. By the time he finished, the room was silent, not with disinterest but with respect. Then came the applause, firm and sustained, echoing against the walls. Elliot stood stunned, humbled, as Graham rose and placed a hand on his shoulder, presenting him to the room as the company's newest leading engineer. In that moment, Elliot's life folded back on itself, the years of sacrifice aligning with the promise he had once abandoned. He glanced toward the side of the hall, where Lily sat beside Oliver, their hands clasped as they watched him. She smiled at him, the same smile she had given him countless times before, the smile that had carried him through the darkest days. And he understood, with a clarity that made his throat tighten, that everything had begun with her. It was her kindness that had changed Oliver, her belief that had restored him, her presence that had opened the door to this new life. He had given up his dreams for her, and in return, she had given them back. The evening ended with celebration, but for Elliot, the true triumph was quieter. Later, as they walked home through streets washed in the glow of street lamps, Lily chattered about how proud she was, about how Oliver had clapped louder than anyone, about how one day she would make her own presentations. Elliot listened, his heart full, his eyes misted. He squeezed her hand, unable to find words that matched the depth of his gratitude. They reached their small apartment, unchanged in its simplicity, but to Elliot it no longer felt like a cage. It felt like the beginning of something greater, not because of wealth or recognition, but because he had finally stepped into the fullness of who he was meant to be. As he lay in bed that night, Lily asleep in the next room, Elliot thought back to the bakery, to a piece of bread shared between children. It was such a small act, yet it had unraveled years of grief and fear, weaving together lives that might otherwise have remained apart. He understood now that fate was not always grand or dramatic. Sometimes it was hidden in the ordinary, waiting for someone to reach out with kindness. He closed his eyes, a faint smile on his lips, and let sleep take him, knowing that tomorrow would not be the same as yesterday. For the first time in many years, he felt not the weight of regret, but the lightness of hope, and with it, the quiet certainty that he and Lily were stepping into a new life. One shaped not by loss, but by love, resilience, and the power of a simple act that had changed everything. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some journeys are too meaningful to keep to yourself.